Welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us, I am a trauma therapist specializing in narcissistic abuse and spiritual abuse, and today we are breaking down Mike Bickle's personal statement he released on December 12th. Mike writes, "To my family and friends, with a very heavy heart, I want to express how deeply grieved I am that my past sins have led to so much pain, confusion, and division in the body of Christ in this hour." All right, off to a decent start. "I sadly admit that 20 plus years ago, I sinned by engaging in inappropriate behavior. My moral failures were real." Okay, pause. I don't love this sentence because it appears that he's already trying to gain some distance from these quote sins or moral failures. I won't even really get into the weeds with what the allegations were against Mike. We don't really know a lot of specifics at this point, but I will put screenshots to those initial statements of allegations here, and you can pause to read them. It does insinuate that there were more than one victim and that these kinds of behaviors spanned across decades, like perhaps they weren't limited to just that time frame 20 plus years ago. In addition to the fact that he is gaining some distance here by emphasizing 20 plus years ago, his past sins, things like that, like, oh, that's so the old me. He is still not acknowledging the power differential or owning any sense of misconduct. Even then, hey, let's assume that there is, quote, only one, and let's say it was 20 plus years ago. Let's say he hadn't done a thing since then. Even this would warrant some more ownership and accountability and acknowledgement of knowing that what he has done is wrong. Like, this is not just an affair. This isn't just, a moral slip up. He's not acknowledging the fact that this is coming from someone who was 19 when this started and he was 42 and an internationally renowned minister. So this is an appropriate time, before we really get into the rest of the content of this letter, to do a little brief overview of clergy sexual misconduct and do some delineations between what constitutes clergy sexual misconduct versus what would constitute an affair or just like some inappropriate behaviors. So I'll put some screenshots here. This comes from abuseresponseandprevention.ca. So essentially, ministers and those in the clergy have a fiduciary responsibility to their congregants or the people to whom they minister. Kind of like therapists and attorneys, there is a higher standard for the relationships that one in that position of a power dynamic is able to have with someone who is, quote, in their flock. Clergy sexual misconduct is any sexual behavior, verbal or physical, that is between a clergy member and a person to whom they are ministering or a person in their congregation. So in this case, with this particular Jane Doe, this was a case in which not only was she young at the age of 19 and allegedly Mike Bickle's friend's daughter who is coming to Kansas City to be under Mike's ministry, but this is also someone who personally reveres Mike as a respected minister and believes what he says and believes his prophecies and what he is speaking into her life. So all that to say, even if it is just one, there's really not an appropriate acknowledgement, at least at this point in the letter, that Mike sees the power dynamic and that what he has done is wrong and is beyond the scope of what one would just call like an affair or moral failings. Before we move on, I also want to circle back and just say that the language here is intentionally vague. On first glance, I'm kind of hoping like, okay, well, we're starting off vague. If this goes as it should, then we don't need all the nitty-gritty details, but we do need some ownership of what he has actually been able to reckon with and put words and language to. Like, has he been able to put language to the fact that he was using prophetic words to manipulate? Does he acknowledge that this person was a sheep in his flock, so to speak, and he failed her and misled her? Does he take responsibility for his part, or is he viewing this as just some mutual complicity here, like some mutual consent between two adults? Because not only does it matter with age, I mean, some people could, argue the lines of like, okay, well, she was 19, she was an adult. But then again, I've mentioned this in past videos, it is not the same when we're talking about a power differential in a professional, ethical, spiritual, and moral domain. At this point in the statement, it's very vague, intentionally so, and one could only hope that Mike goes into a little bit more ownership and accountability of seeing that what he has done is wrong here. We do need to see that Mike has an awareness that he has profoundly impacted the life of someone who was trusting him as her spiritual leader before her prefrontal cortex even had a chance to develop. And before we really get into the weeds here, I just want to make the note that typically with narcissistic apologies, here are some of the things I look out for. Are they admitting to, quote, the tip of the iceberg? Like, I acknowledge and admit, and I'm so sorry for this one thing, and then neglecting to mention or address the rest. Essentially, like, I'm going to admit to the bare minimum that like looks the best here. Another thing is going to be vague or very evasive language, kind of letting you fill in the blanks for yourself. That way, if you come back and say like, well, you didn't seem sorry or you didn't admit to this, they can be like, I did, I put it right there, because they are putting a big enough umbrella to cover a multitude of issues, but keeping it vague enough to still deny it if it is presented to them without hard evidence. It might be a smart move legally. You can tell that this was very carefully crafted, but it does not show an appropriate level of accountability and acknowledgement. Another thing that I often look for in order to determine what is a genuine apology versus what is more of an evasive or a narcissistic apology is I look for, do they fully see the scope of their wrongdoings, or do they still, at least in some way, feel either A, justified in their actions and are trying to more like explain and justify why they did what they did, and also, do they feel like a victim in this situation that everybody else seems to be overreacting, but it really wasn't that big of a deal? Before we go any further, I'd love to just attach a screenshot. This is the narcissist's prayer. That didn't happen. And if it did, it wasn't that bad. And if it was, that's not a big deal. And if it is, that's not my fault. And if it was, I didn't mean it. And if I did, you deserved it. So what we're looking at here in line 1 is we will often see a denial of the facts that didn't really happen. Okay, well then if enough evidence comes out that it did happen, well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that much. Like only this happened, only that happened. Again, minimizing, shrinking down what happened to a more, in the narcissist's eyes, appropriate thing. Okay, so then in the next line, it's not a big deal. Okay, now we're minimizing the impact. Like, please quit being so dramatic about all of this. Like, we were two adults. And then again, if it is a big deal, okay, if the impact was bad, that's definitely not my fault. That was something happened. That was somebody's fault, but it was not mine. And then when there is fault to be found and there's no other way to reason around it, then we go into like good heart intentions. My heart was in such a good place. I didn't know any better. I really loved Jesus. I just was trying to do the best I could with what I had. And then lastly, if it really is reasoned out, like, nah, man, you meant it. Here are your words. Here is what you said. Then the narcissist's mind is able to reason that whoever they have wronged has actually done something, and they, they can say it in more crafty ways than this, but essentially like, you had it coming, you opened the door. This is where we hear things like, well, you were looking out for power and money. You just wanted da-da-da-da-da. And I'm not saying Mike or any of his people are necessarily officially promoting that narrative, but they're not promoting that narrative either. And just to clarify, there have been some voices out of IHOP, executive leadership team, spokespeople, ministry partners with Mike who have been promoting that narrative that the advocates are out for power and money. Well, that's my time. I'll be back for part 2.